My Chinese parents kicked me out of the house because, quote, I'm not good enough. Well, guess what? Joke's on them. I'm now a multi-millionaire and I plan on getting a little bit of revenge. Might seem petty, but here's what happened. I, 28 male, always had a problem with my family because, well, I'm Asian. We have this stigma where you must do excellently at school. Otherwise, you're a black goose for the family. The problem was, I wasn't very good at school. It's true that most Asian kids do great at school, and it has become a joke. But it's only true because they usually have super strict parents, like mine, who keep putting stress on them to do so good. It's not fun at all, especially if you're not a gifted kid like me. Anyways, elementary school was easy enough. I had to put in extra work, but I still got good enough grades that they pretended to be happy and smiled at me. I was still a little kid, so I did not realize just how cruel they can be. Middle school, however, was when things started taking a turn. I remember my first quiz in 6th grade. It was a math quiz, and I was sick the day before, but my parents didn't know. I struggled so hard, but I still tried my best to study, but alas, it wasn't enough. It was the first C+ I've ever gotten in my life. As soon as my teacher gave me the paper, I was absolutely horrified of what my parents would say or do. It was that bad. I came home that evening and tried to hide it, hoping that they had forgotten about the quiz. Everything was going well, and they did not ask about the quiz. Until halfway through dinner, when my brother suddenly smirked and asked me how I did on my quiz. The look on his face said it all, and it was like he intended to make my parents notice. My brother, unlike me, was some sort of school genius. He always got straight A's, never got a bad grade, and was every teacher's favorite student. He was 1 year older than me, so we were always compared to each other, both at school and at home. I got so sick and tired of being asked, "Oh, you're his brother, but how?" At home, he was always the benchmark that parents kept asking me why I wasn't like. On every single exam, they would compare my grade to the grade he got the year before, and used it to humiliate and degrade me. Anyways, right as he said so at dinner, my parents stopped what they were doing and asked me for the exam paper. I tried to make up an excuse, but it never worked with them. I knew their stern faces that they expected a bad grade, which they always did. I told them I'd bring them the paper after dinner, but they literally made me get up from the table to go to get it and come back down. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs, but I got it and showed it to them. That night was probably the most yelling and humiliation I've ever had in my life. They blew up in my face, telling me that I'm a failure, that if I continue like this, I would not amount to anything. I tried to explain to them that I was sick and could not study well, but they told me it was no excuse and again kept defending their actions by using my brother and his marks in the previous year. At one point, I just zoned out and let them yell without processing what they were even saying. At the end, I just heard that if I did not get an A+ on the next quiz, I would not go with them on vacation that year. That was the incident that started the whole thing, and it only got worse from then on out. I kept trying to get high grades, but middle school was way harder than elementary. I got B's and C's, and had to endure their breakdowns in lectures. What made everything worse was my brother constantly in their corner, smirking at me like he was proud of the fact that he was a nerd. The thing is, my brother was an actual loser. He had absolutely no life, barely any friends, and knew nothing about the world other than school stuff and studying. Sometimes I felt bad for him, but most of the time I was just furious and resentful. My parents had a whole arsenal of punishments for every quiz, homework, or exam I got a bad grade in. I was deprived of TV, video games, and heck, even vacations. After 8th grade, because of my report card, it had 3 B's and 2 C's, my parents and brother went back to China on vacation for a month, while I stayed home. On one hand, it was sad, but on the other hand, I was glad to spend some time away from them. Even if I had to do everything myself and they installed a camera to see if anything happened. Over time, I felt studying less and less, just to annoy them in rebellion. They did not realize that what they were doing was doing more than harm than good, and that it would come back to bite them much, much later. The worst kind of punishment they inflicted was locking me up into an empty basement that had spiders, with only a textbook with me. I once spent a day and a half down there with barely any food, and I was not allowed to go back up until I memorized the whole chapter. On one occasion, my mom was picking me up from school when she saw me trying to talk to the, quote, cool kids. I really wanted to get to know them and fit in, but my mom literally came up and grabbed me by the arm and dragged me to the car. She was telling me that they should not be friends with failures who won't have a future. That sentence kept ringing in my head constantly, and the feeling of embarrassment that haunted me all throughout middle and high school never went away. High school was the peak of all the drama. My grades continued to get worse, and by 12th grade, I'd finally gotten my first F. A part of it was me actually struggling, but a large part was me intentionally neglecting everything just to anger them even more. In 12th grade, my report card came back with the fact that I had that repeat the year. The explosion that set off that day was nuclear. My parents never hit me, but the words were far more hurtful than their fists could have provided. They practiced every gaslighting, guilt-tripping, and psychological manipulation trick in the book. They made me literally think that I was unwell, and that I had some sort of problem to the point where I wanted to go see a specialist. I was immature to their offensiveness slightly, but I was still shocked when they literally kicked me out of the house and told me never to come back until I actually made a human being out of myself. I was shocked and sad. But then I suddenly felt a wave of happiness and euphoria. I'd finally achieved independence and had no responsibility in front of them anymore. I quickly found a place to stay at my friend's house, and he told me that he would help me find a job and get through the year. I quickly got a job working in retail, and then I started the school year fresh. Shockingly, things seemed much easier. Without my parents constantly on my back, I was stress-free and could actually understand my subjects and assignments. That year, I had the best grades I've ever gotten in my life, and I made sure not to let my parents know at all. My brother visits the school a couple times and saw me there. He asked me how I was doing and if I was still a failure. So I told him that it was none of his business and that he should get back to whatever life he doesn't have after graduating. Of course, he had a college all lined up and was leaving the entire state soon. I finally graduated, and my parents did not even attend the ceremony. I've been doing things on my own for a year now, so I decided to continue my journey and go to college. Like everyone, I took out a student loan, continued to work minimum wage jobs, and got myself through college, studying programming and computer science. Even though I wasn't great at math, I really found myself in the world of computers, and I was very good at it. But my final year in college, I've been freelancing pretty successful until one of my clients offered that I come work for his company. After graduation, I worked there for a couple years and learned all I could to start my own tech startup. My relationship with my parents during college was simply texting every now and then, and they asked if I was okay. They seemed interested in talking to me once again, and they learned that I graduated high school, which was messed up since they did not talk to me once in that entire senior year. I only visited on holidays and told them nothing about what I was up to. All they knew was that I was still working in retail until I graduate. Once I started my own tech company, though, I was tempted to tell them about the success, but I needed to wait a little bit more. I knew that the time I told them about what I was really doing had to be perfect. After 3 years, my company's stock skyrocketed, and I made $10 million at the end of the fiscal year. I couldn't believe it, and I wanted to go and gloat to my parents so bad. My company was gaining popularity fast, and it became well known even to my parents. I got a call one day asking me if that company they heard about on TV was the same one I was working for. I told them yes, and that I was actually the founder. They did not have a reaction on the phone, so I knew I had to go visit them and look them in the eyes. A few days later, I went to visit them at my brother's engagement party. The entire family was there, even relatives from China, so it was the perfect opportunity. I came dressed in my most expensive suit. I pulled up skirting in a Lamborghini. I got some insane eyes that day, and everyone was all over me until I got my parents and told them all about my successful company and how much money I made. I expected that they would not be happy, but I did not expect the level of denial they were in. They kept telling me that I was reckless and wasting my money, and asked me if I was doing dirty business or money laundering. They just could not accept the fact that I was successful and kept trying to bring me down in any way they could. I told them in front of everyone that I was literally a millionaire, pointed at my brother and said he was a loser who barely has a job and is getting engaged with his parents' money, and that I was grateful for the fact that I had no contact with them the entire time I became successful and left. Well, I did not hear back for a couple days, and I did not expect to hear back from them ever. Until, ring, 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 phone ringing. My mom was on the phone and her voice was completely different than what I've heard my entire life. She was being sweet, caring, and the opposite of what she always sounded like. I knew something fishy was up, and she just kept telling me that I needed to meet with her and Dad for something important. I was skeptical, but I was curious enough to try and listen to what they wanted. I went over and got the welcoming of a king. It was just them, but they greeted me so warmly, offered me food that they said they made especially for me, and kept acting like the nicest people in the world. I wanted to believe that they were really like this, and that I missed out on years of this behavior because of my struggle in school. They spent an hour apologizing and telling me how wrong they were all those years. It was nice, but they said everything in such a fake yellowish way that made me even more skeptical and annoyed. I knew they were hiding their true intentions and were just putting up on an act. But I kept playing along. Eventually, they invited me to a dinner party they had planned for this weekend, and then my cousin's birthday in China. I had zero interest in both events, but I wanted to see how far they would take this. It was the weekend, and I was getting ready to go to the dinner party, but I thought I would sabotage it and do whatever I wanted to see what their reaction would be. Even though they said to dress formally, I wore my sweatpants, gym t-shirt, sneakers, and went there unkempt and without a care in this world. As soon as I entered, I saw several members of the family and our neighbors. My parents were acting like this perfect little family, fake smiling and everyone pretending like they actually cared. In truth, they were just looking for validation and social pretensions. I intentionally entered the house with shoes on, which normally would have driven them crazy, but they had to keep up the act. As soon as I entered, they grabbed my arm and kept showing me off to everyone as this perfect, successful son. I kept getting so many, "Oh, how'd you do it?" questions. But what made me the angriest was when people kept telling me that their efforts with me paid off and that they must be proud. I'm going to tell you right now, this was the one that struck a nerve, and what made things even worse was when they told me that I had to come to our cousin's wedding in China. and they joked that I'd have them all be in first class, and kept talking about my money, asking me for stuff they wanted. Well, at this point, I blew up in front of everyone and told them how it really was. I told them to cut the crap and to stop being so pretentious and fake. I told everyone how they really treated me my entire life, how they called me a disappointment, how they punished me and left me alone, and how they eventually kicked me out on the house for bad grades onto the streets. They tried to laugh it off, but I just kept going. I knew my parents' one weakness was not looking perfect in front of everyone. They were really showy that way. I told them that I'm glad they kicked me out because I did not have to spend any more time with them and their obsessive, pedantic attitude towards me. I told them how they made me despise my brother growing up due to constantly comparing me to him. And I told them now he's basically unemployed and all those good grades got him nothing in the long run. I could see their social battery draining and their face was twitching from embarrassment. Some of our family members tried to come to their defense, but I fired back at them too for being the same and told them that their own children hate them. The show's intended audience was our neighbors and family friends, who were absolutely shocked and horrified by the stuff that they had to hear. Eventually, my parents were speechless and the guests turned their attention towards them. They told them that they were horrible parents and that they should all be ashamed of what they've done. People started boarding their cars and leaving immediately, telling them not to invite them to any more events. My parents just kept trying to salvage anything, but most people were against them. In the end, all the guests left, it was just them. My mom was crying her eyes out, and my dad's head was in the floor from embarrassment. They tried to murder or yell at me, but I yelled back and told them that it was too late and that they can't do that to me anymore. I told them how years of crying myself to bed because I thought I'd be a loser that did not amount to anything were finally over. And this is now how we'll be old, alone, and without anything to do. I told them that I will never come back there, and that if I did stay with them, I would put them in an old people's home as quickly as I could. They tried to tell me that they did not mean it, and it was just how they were brought up. But I told them that's not an excuse and that I never wanted to see them again. After that day, I lived on my own and never tried to reconnect with my family. I heard that my brother got married and he seems to be struggling even more with money and responsibility. I didn't know anything about my parents until, well, a few months later, I got a call that my mom was in the hospital, and it was serious. It was a tough decision, but I decided not to visit. The next day, I got another call that she had passed away and her last words were wanting to see me. I wanted to sympathize, but there was too much bad blood in the air for me. I didn't even care to go to the funeral, and I cut myself off completely from the rest of the family members after that. My wife and mother-in-law have a toxic relationship. Most of it's related to my mother-in-law allowing her ex-husband to savagely beat my wife as a child and refusing to leave the relationship, even lying for her husband when my wife was finally old enough to tell someone. It only stopped when he abandoned them family for a younger woman and eventually died. Despite this, my wife has saved her mother time and time again. Mother-in-law had a brain tumor when we first got married, and her husband at the time wanted to refuse treatment. We basically kidnapped her, took her to the best treatment center and paid thousands of dollars out of pocket to ensure she got the best treatment and let her live with us for 6 months. My wife quitting her job to be her caretaker, getting her to the rehab before moving her back when she was well enough to be self-sufficient. She was given a second chance by my wife. Her husband never even visited in that 6 months. How did she repay my wife, you ask? A few months later, called her on her birthday and accused her of stealing $300. Keep in mind, she had lived with us for 6 months and we took care of everything, including thousands of dollars in medical bills, but her husband, had become enraged over a check she had written to my wife when she offered to help with some bills one time. She actually threatened charges, so my wife despondently hung up. I immediately wrote a check. It wasn't about the money, and a letter about how much she hurt my wife, and they only spoke rarely for the next 5 years. One of those conversations was an intervention to ask her mother to please pay for a long-term care policy, as now that we have children, we cannot repeat the financial commitment we've made earlier. It was about $300 per month, and we offered to pay half. Her mother is a high-maintenance person and spends quite a bit on herself, but refuses to pay anything, so we didn't do it. Fast forward to 6 months ago. Mother-in-law had a serious fall, and her terrible husband let her lie on the driveway for 3 hours because he did not want to pay for the ambulance. He got his redneck kids to pick her up and take her to the ER, further injuring her. She was completely unable to walk for 4 months and is now barely able to. Has trouble dressing herself and going to the bathroom. Of course, my wife saved her again because her husband had her in a terrible facility, and she was calling my wife begging to be saved. We took her to a rehab place near us. We lived about 10 hours away from her home. Her insurance paid for 90 days, but the last 3 months, we've been paying thousands out of pocket while hoping she can qualify for PACE. She doesn't qualify because she's still married, and her husband has plenty of assets. He refuses to visit or help out with bills. Her only option is to divorce him and sue him to sell the assets to get herself some sort of cash, or at least qualify for Medicaid. She's been kicked out of her current assisted living for refusing rehab and berating staff. She's racist. We simply can't afford to put her somewhere else, so until she's divorced, she's going to have to live with us. This is depressing reality, and my wife has admitted she hates her mother, gets no joy from the relationship, but feels responsible for her care. We have a 2-story home with our masters on the bottom, so we're having to make our kids share a room and sleep in a small guest room upstairs for the foreseeable future. This would be easier to swallow if mother-in-law was grateful or helpful in any way. She's bossy, entitled, horrible to our children, and just a weird petty person. This isn't just my opinion. I've sat in my wife's therapy sessions and heard her say all these things about mother-in-law. My wife knows how terrible she is, how much I dislike her, but I don't show it to mother-in-law. I understand how my wife has to do this. Any tips on making it work? I honestly don't want to be at my home. I'd rather work late, travel more, and be out of that place. I love my wife and kids, and I miss them terribly. But mother-in-law makes me miserable, and my wife miserable, and she lashes out at me and the children. Gonna try to suck it up and deal with it, but the future isn't bright.